Well, tonight we're in Joshua chapter 11. As we've seen, Joshua, he led his troops and he went straight across the middle of the land of Canaan to divide the land. And we've seen last week where he went through and he conquered the southern part. But now Joshua and the Israelites, they're getting ready to move north to the northern section. Now, the tough part is, this is where the toughest armies are, is in the northern part. The armies in the northern section, they were prepared. You know, they were aware that the Lord had promised to give the land of Canaan to the Israelites as their inheritance. And that kind of sets us up for chapter 11 of Joshua. Let's jump right into the Word. And it came to pass, when Jabin, king of Hazor, heard these things, that he sent to Jobab, king of Madon, to the king of Shimron, to the king of Akshapah, and then to the kings who were from the north and the mountains and the plains south of Shinroth in the lowland, and in the heights of Bordor on the west. And verse 3, to the Canaanites in the east and in the west, and the Amorite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Jebusite in the mountains, and the Hivite below Hermon and the land of Mizpah. Now, after we get through tonight with this sermon, each one of y'all have to go back through and pronounce those names. So let's jump right into verse 4. So they went out, they and all their armies with them, as many people as the sand that was on the seashore, and multitude with very many horses and chariots. When all these things had met together, they came and they camped together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. But the Lord said to Joshua, do not be afraid because of them, for tomorrow about this time I will deliver all of them slain before Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire. So Joshua and all the people of war with him came against them suddenly by the waters of Merom, and they attacked them. And verse 8, and the Lord delivered them into the hand of Israel, who defeated them and chased them to greater Sidon, to the brook Mizrapoth, and to the valley of Mizpah eastward. They attacked them until they left none of them remaining. So Joshua did to them as the Lord had told him. He hamstrung their horses, and he burned their chariots with fire. Joshua turned back at that time, and he took Hazor and struck his king with the sword, for Hazor was formerly the head of all those kingdoms. And they struck at the people who were in it at the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them. There was none left breathing. Then he burned Hazor with fire, so all the cities of those kings and all their kings Joshua took, and he struck with the edge of the sword. He utterly destroyed them, as Moses the servant of the Lord had commanded. Verse 13, but as for the cities that stood on their mounds, Israel burned none of them, except Hazor only, which Joshua burned. And all the spoil of these cities and the livestock, the children of Israel took as booty for themselves. But they struck every man with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them, and they left none breathing. As the Lord had commanded Moses, his servant, so Moses commanded Joshua, and so Joshua did. He left nothing of all that the Lord had commanded Moses. Well, we see here in these first 15 verses, here we see a last-ditch effort of the enemy to defeat and destroy the Israelites. Now, there was a huge alliance that was formed by King Jabin of Hazor, which was the largest of the city-states, and also he had the most power over any of the others. Now, the Canaanite kings, they had heard how Joshua and the Israelites, how they had had victory as they entered the promised land. And here's the thing to keep in mind. The northern kings knew that none of the southern kings were able to stop them. So here we see that King Jabin of Hazor, he wanted to make one last attempt to stop Joshua. So what did he do? He called all the surrounding nations together to mobilize for war. Now you're saying, well, how did he mobilize all these people, and how many of them were there? Well, I'm glad you asked that. The historian Josephus said that the Northern Coalition Army numbered about 300,000 infantry, about 100,000 cavalry, and about 20,000 chariots. Now these chariots, really think about this. These chariots, they had these real sharp curved blades that were attached to his wheels. And as the wheels went around and around, these sharp blades, they would go into circles, and what they would do is they'd cut down the foot soldiers. Now in these chariots also, it carried a soldier that usually had a bow on it, and also it carried extra spears. Now keep in mind, there's 20,000 chariots. Now just imagine looking out and seeing all this ahead of you. As a matter of fact, it says here in the Scriptures that in the words of Joshua, he said that they numbered the sand of the seashore. Now, I'm sure, and by looking through Joshua's eyes, by appearance, it looked that maybe him and the Israelites were at a disadvantage because there were so many of them compared to him and the Israelites. But here's the thing to keep in mind. This King Jabin, he failed to take into account the special weapon that the Israelites had. Who was behind the Israelites? The warrior God himself. Now, King Jabin, he didn't know that God had already warned Moses that Israel was going to be faced with such a situation. Now, when you look back and you read through Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 1 and 4, we will see that God had warned Moses that all this was going to take place. Now, Joshua was very nervous about all this. Now, keep in mind, if Joshua wasn't nervous, why would the Lord say to him, don't fear? Why, the Lord said to him not to fear because he is fearful. Now, the Lord says, Joshua, don't fear, but here's what I want you to do. I want you to go cripple their horses and burn their chariots. He says, Joshua, when you do this, don't worry about it because the victory is going to be yours. As a matter of fact, the victory is going to be about this time the next day. So Joshua took that into account. What he did was he launched a surprise attack. What he did was he moved against the armies, and it says here in the verses, by the waters of Meron. Now, this waters of Meron, this was about 4,000 feet above sea level. Now, it's very obvious that Jabin, when he called these groups together, he didn't plan to do battle there because the land wasn't flat. The land was very hilly, plus he's 4,000 feet above sea level. But what that was to be, the area where he was meeting all these other surrounding nations, that was going to be a place where they were going to meet and probably go through a battle plan. But as we see here, Joshua and his army, what they do, they caught him off guard when they arrived unexpectedly. Jabin's horses and the chariots, they were very useless here on the battleground because it was so uneven. It says that, as a matter of fact, the enemies, that they were so afraid that they ran for their lives, but Joshua and the Israelites, they chased them until there was no survivors that were left. Now, Joshua did just as the Lord had commanded him to do. Keep this in mind. This is one of the key parts. Joshua did as the Lord had commanded him to do. What did he do? He says he crippled their horses and he burned their chariots. Now, why would God command such a thing to be done? Well, the reason why is so that the horses and the chariots couldn't be used in the future. Now, the hamstring means to cut the tendon of the leg. That was to disable the horse, so the horse couldn't be used again. Then we see here in verse 10 that Joshua turned and captured the northern city. This northern city, the capital was Hazor. That was the city of Javan. It was burned. The other cities that stood on the mountains, it says that they were destroyed, but they were not burned. Now, perhaps maybe Joseph kind of felt that these cities that stood on the mountains, they would be useful to the Israelites who would later on that would settle there. Now, it says here that the people of all the cities were killed and all the spoil was taken by the Israelites. But I like this. Joshua had carefully obeyed all the instructions that were given by God. Now, as we see, the theme throughout the book of Joshua here seems to be obedience because it's repeated so frequently. Because one of the aspects, I believe, my personal opinion, one of the aspects of the life of the individual believer is that he needs to be able to control their obedience to the Lord. You know, we always can't understand the understanding of maybe of others or maybe things that we're going through. Sometimes we just don't know why. Sometimes because we don't have all the facts. We can't control what other people say or how they treat us. But however, here's the key thing. I believe that we can control our choice to obey God. So whatever challenges that you and I are going to face, I believe that the Bible contains relevant instructions that you and I can either choose to ignore or we can choose to follow. As we studied all throughout here, that when the Israelites, when they stayed obedient to the Lord was right there to guide them and direct them and lead their paths and everything. But when the Israelites chose to be disobedient, the Lord just kind of backed off a little bit and let them go their own way until they hit so far. Then when they cried out to the Lord again and got obedient, then the Lord would then make His presence very, very known to them. So we see right through these verses, the first 15, that Joshua was very obedient to what the Lord had called him to do. But let's take a look here in verse 16. Thus Joshua took all this land, the mountain country and all the south, all the land of Goshen, the lowland, and Jordan, plain the mountains of Israel and its lowlands, from Mount Halak and the Ats and the Seir, even as far as Baal-Gad in the valley of Lebanon between Mount Hermon. He captured all their kings, and he struck them down, and he killed them. Joshua made war a long time with all those kings. Verse 19, there is not a city that made peace with the children of Israel except the Hittites, the inhabitants of Gibeon, and all the others, it says here, that they took in the battle. But look at verse 20. For it was of the Lord to harden their hearts that they should come against Israel in battle, that He might utterly destroy them, and that He might receive no mercy, or they might receive no mercy, but that He might destroy them as the Lord had commanded Moses. Here we see in verse 16 that the victory over the entire land here, as we see Joshua, he conquered, it says here that he stripped all these major cities so that they couldn't be mobilized again to come against the Israelites. In other words, what Joshua did here was he took away the backbone of this opposition. He took away the main strength of them. But it says here that he left the smaller cities and the smaller towns, and they were to be conquered by the individual tribes of the Israelites. Keep in mind that we're going to see here in the future chapters that now that they're in the promised land, now that they've taken over, now Joshua is going to have to start dividing the inheritance to the 12 tribes. We see right in these verses here that there was no nation that had sought any kind of peace with the Israelites except the tribe of Gibeon. As we look through these verses, it says that it took a long time. As a matter of fact, it took about 7 long years for this to go through it. Now, the reason I emphasize that is because as we study this and talk about it, it only takes a few minutes for us to talk about it. But in reality, it took 7 years. Now, why do I want to emphasize that? Is because I believe that now we're starting out a new year. Right through here, we're starting out in a new location, near a new building. And I believe that we're going to come across some things, and we're going to expect some quick changes and quick victories in our lives throughout this new year, 2010. But I just want us to be aware of that we need to be like the Israelites, that our walk with God is a lifelong journey. It's not something that just takes place overnight. But some of these things that you and I are going to be hoping for in this new coming year, hey, it may take a while for them to come about in our lives. Now, you like Joshua, you get afraid of some uncertain things. You may get impatient. You may even want to give up. And the reason I say that is because sometimes it's hard for you and I to see progress. But you know what? If you and I just hang in there, we can look back at the situation and we can see that God had never stopped working all throughout whatever it is that we may be facing. The Lord is with us. But look right through here in verse 20. It says that He utterly destroyed them. Now that utterly destroy, that means to annihilate, eliminate, or to abolish. The idea, a lot of people have a hard time getting the concept of this idea that God would be set on a total destruction of a nation or a group of people. As a matter of fact, to some people, they would find this to be very, very offensive to them. They would say, how can a good God be so set on total destruction, or how can God even want to endure something with such an act? Well, you know what? In looking at this here, you and I need to keep a few things in mind. You know, people can become so savage or evil or corrupt that they're beyond repair, they're beyond repentance, they're beyond hope. That's what's known in the Scriptures as a cup of iniquity. In other words, being full, being so full to the point that they overflow and they continue to overflow with all the evil and the sin in their lives. Now, here with the Canaanites, if you look back at Leviticus chapter 18, we'll see that these guys have been so vicious that Scripture say that they were into incest, they were into adultery, they were into child sacrifice, homosexuality, bestiality, and they were hostile to all of God and God's ways. Now, history, as you and I go back and we look over it, history has shown that such behavior as this, it can be true in an individual person's life, but it can also be true in nations. Now, it doesn't matter whether it's an individual or a nation. God just wants justice, and God is going to execute judges against whether it's a person or a whole nation of people. Now, one reason I believe that God was wanting justice against these Canaanites is because He was just protecting His people, the Israelites. Some people say, I just have a hard time understanding that God is a God of love. Well, you know what? God is a God of love. But the Scriptures are very clear to tell us that God is also a just God. You know, and that He does not allow injustice to go unpunished. If He did, then He'd be a God of evil. So that person or that nation, they had to be judged. Now, in this case right through here, God had used Israel as His instrument of justice and judgment against this nation of Canaan. The Canaanites, they were destroyed because of their evil. Now, something else that we need to think about through here, God doesn't show any type of partiality or any type of favoritism. And the reason I say that is because God is going to warn the Israelites here in the next few chapters that they too would face judgment if they disobeyed Him. Now, why would God say this? This would be a warning that they could not adopt, and they should not adopt, all this immoral behavior and all this unrighteous lifestyle of the Canaanites, or they too are going to be judged. So God used Joshua and the Israelites here to get rid of the largest part of all these evil people. But look at verse 21. And at that time Joshua came and he cut off the Anakim from the mountains, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, from all the mountains of Judah, and from all the mountains of Israel. Joshua utterly destroyed them with their cities. None of the Anakims were left in the land of the children of Israel. They remained only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod. So Joshua took the whole land according to all the Lord had said to Moses, and Joshua gave it as an inheritance to Israel according to their divisions by their tribes. Now look at this. Then the land rested from war. So here we're seeing that Joshua and the Israelites, where they defeated the Anakims. Now, not a lot is said right through here in these verses concerning this battle, but it was really a very important battle for Israel. These Anakims, these giants here, they were the people that lived in the land. Remember the 12 spies that were sent out by Moses, and they come back and they talked about them, and they said these giants, that they frightened these spies so much that these spies felt, in comparison, they felt like a grasshopper compared to these giants. So now here it is, some 40 years later, and Joshua's going in, he's going to do battle against the same tribe of people that had frightened them before. But here's the neat part. This time Joshua and the Israelites, they did not let the size of the giants frighten them. They destroyed the majority of them in their cities. Keep in mind, it says right through there in verse 22 that none of the Anakims were left in the land of the children of Israel. But here it is, they remained only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod. So here we see that there were some people that were left in these three cities, and later on, we're going to see a couple more fellows come out from these areas. Number one, King Saul. He came out of this Anakims. Also, Goliath was from that area, from one of those tribes. So now, we see through here that there's really no large enemies that were left to combat God's people within the Promised Land. It's very, very interesting here because never in the history of the Israelites had they ever been able to possess land, build themselves a home, or to have a place that they could call their own. But here we see now the Promised Land was finally theirs. They finally had their own land that they could live on. And it says here in verse 23 that then the land had rest from war. We see that this closes the first section of Joshua. Now in chapter 12, next week, we're going to see where it gives us the list of all these defeated kings, and then we're going to see the distribution of the Israelites' inheritance, the Promised Land. You know, I think one of the things that we really need to notice tonight, going through this, that the Lord was with Joshua and the Israelites. No matter how tough or how outnumbered they look, the Lord says, I'm with you. You go through it. I'm right there by your side. Now, the Lord gave the Israelites and Joshua a promise. But look at here. As we see later on, it says that Joshua had done all the things that the Lord had commanded of him. So here we see that God gave the Israelites the promise, and Joshua went through and he did everything that the Lord had asked him to do. I believe you and I, we had the same promises with the Lord, that the Lord gives you and I the different promises. He's with us. He'll never leave us. He'll never forsake us. He has a plan for your life, a plan for my life, and that all that He requires and asks of you and I is that we just be obedient to the things that He asks us to do, and He'll be with us forever. And as I look right through here, what a great promise that the Lord had given them. And as we see that after the war, after the battle had taken place, it says then that the land had rest. And we see here that all the Israelites were now going to receive what they had so long been waiting for. So long been waiting for. It didn't happen just overnight. These guys have been going for years and years and years. But keep in mind, out of all that generation that had left out of Egypt, all through the wilderness experience, that only 2 got to experience this new promised land out of that whole generation. Who were they? That's right, Joshua and Caleb. Those were the 2 that had stayed faithful to the Lord. And my friends, saints, that's what you and I need to do. No matter how bad, how things may look to you and I, we just need to stay faithful to God. And I guarantee you that He will never disappoint you. But if we just stay faithful to Him, we'll see His promise delivered in our own lives. Let's go to the Lord and thank Him just for His goodness, for the time that we've had tonight.